The same thing happened in the fight with Holyfield, the first fight. At the end of the 11th round, when everybody was waving their flags and celebrating, I told Lennox, "You're losing the fight." He looked at me like, "Yo, man, what are you talking about?" And everyone in the corner was looking at me like I was crazy. I said, "We got to win this round big. Land flashy punches, move away, look real good. In your mind, win every minute by scoring it yourself." He does that, and he comes back to me and looks at me like, "What did you have me do all that for?" We found out he won the 12th round on all of the scorecards, and they still called it a draw. But he did what I asked him to do. In the fight with Vitaly Klitschko, at the end of the 4th round, I told Lennox, "Lennox, you're losing the heavyweight championship of the world. You're used to being a tall fighter and pulling back and being out of range, but this guy's taller than you." And Vitaly was fighting like a man obsessed that night. So Lennox looked at me and I said to him, "We got to go to the streets. You got to go out and change your style. And when you jab, don't just jab, push your jab all the way through where you can push him off balance." Because I saw that Vitaly crosses his legs a lot when he punches and he would be out of balance. I said, "When you get on the inside, throw punches. If you miss him with a hook, bang him with your shoulders." When he got inside, there was a little trick I showed him, how to slowly get your right hand down, real slow and quietly, and then rip an uppercut. With everything I told him to do, Lennox looks at me, goes out there, and wins the 5th round big time. And then he wins the 6th round big time. And when he came back at the end of the 6th round, he looked at me and he said, "I got him now." My instructions were going to be, as soon as the bell rung for the 7th round, to just run out and throw an overhand right and just try to pretty much just crush Vitaly, because I knew there was no way Vitaly could have went 6 more rounds with his face all torn apart like that. So they ended up stopping the fight and he kept his championship. I'll be with Vitaly and Vladimir and we'll be together, and some people will ask, "Mr. Steward, who would have won if that fight had continued with Vitaly and Lennox?" I said, "Lennox was going to win that fight." "Well, you know, Vitaly was ahead." I said, "Ahead is one thing, but he had 6 rounds to go. In a heavyweight fight and one fighter's whole face is torn apart? I mean, it's ridiculous. There is no way he was going to win that. Lennox had been in those situations before and then came back." But the thing about it was he did whatever you asked him to do to win a fight. He could make the adjustments. The fights that he had with Mercer and all those guys and the rematch of Holyfield, he just, to me, was the most exciting heavyweight that I ever worked with, because he could box, he could punch, and he was totally focused and intense. After the first fight with Rackman, when he gets knocked out, because everyone had pretty much taken Rackman kind of lightly, and he did the movie Ocean's 11 and he stayed in Vegas, even though we were fighting in South Africa, for like the last 10 days or something, because he was doing the movie and nobody had that much respect for Rackman. So we get there without enough time to properly focus and adjust to the altitude. Lennox got caught with one punch. It wasn't like he was losing. It was only one punch and he got knocked out. I was so crushed that when I went on the plane, I think I still had my gym stuff on. It was a long ride, and then it took me almost a day and a half to get home because I was so emotionally upset. The thing that I respected so much about Lennox is about a month after that, he calls me up and he says, "Emmanuel, could you meet me for a day or two just to get together and talk?" I said, "Okay." With all of the other fighters, as soon as somebody loses, they always start pointing fingers at everyone else. Lennox was just not that way. We met in Jamaica and I had never been to Jamaica. He had me come down and we just sat and talked for 2 days. He said, "You know what? I realized how I lost the fight. I lost my focus. I lost my intensity, much like I lost it when I lost to Oliver McCall. So we got to go back up to the mountains," which in this case, he meant the Poconos, "and just start over and refocus and come back to win my championship back. It's unusual today. With today's fighters, everybody finds excuses." That was his attitude though. We came back and the great knockout that he had over Rackman, he was the one that saw the opening. He did it himself. I didn't have to show him anything. He saw that every time Rackman would make a defensive motion, he would just merely push his arms out, and he kept pushing his arms out. So Lennox, being very smart, he timed him and kind of threw an awkward right hand over the extended arms and knocked Rahman out. What people don't realize about Lennox also, Lennox might appear to be this gentlemanly guy and this mother's boy, but he was one of the toughest guys that I have ever dealt with. When we had the fight with Mike and they had this first skirmish or whatever you want to call it, when they had the press conference in New York, what people didn't realize is when they were giving all the praises to Mike and they started giving their praises to Lennox, Mike snapped. He charged across the stage at Lennox. But as soon as he got in range, Lennox was the one that cracked Mike. He hit Mike. He didn't back away and run and all that stuff. Lennox was never afraid of Mike Tyson. In fact, on another occasion when we were out, personally I won't go into that, but Lennox intimidated Mike. Lennox, even as a teenager back in Kitchener, Courtney Shand and the guys tell me whenever they had some kind of street fight, they'd always go home and get Lennox to come, and Lennox came in and whooped them all. Lennox was always a rough guy. When we were in the ring for the Mike Tyson fight, and everybody had these yellow and black whatever things that were supposed to be separating us because Mike was an animal and Mike was going to do this and that, Lennox was right there all the time just waiting, and we were actually worried about Lennox wanting to run across and jump on Mike. So in the first round of the fight, Lennox's orders were to go out, stand toe-to-toe with him, and let him realize that you're a big man. And that's what he did. We didn't care about winning or losing the first round, but in the first round, he came out and he battled with Mike. That set the tone of the fight. From that point on, we just settled down and beat him with a systematic jab, and he really wanted to torture Mike in the worst way. He could have knocked him out earlier, but he wanted to just do what he did, bust him up, beat him up, and when he finally knocked him out, he was very happy seeing Mike on the floor with blood coming out of his nostrils and his eyes bleeding, and he was totally just a beaten man. Lennox had a sadistic side in him that very few people realized. I was with Eddie Futch one day, and he and his wife and I were together in Las Vegas, just sitting at a little coffee shop. And I asked him about the Riddick Bowe fight when he threw away the belt rather than fight Lennox. He said, "Emmanuel, that was my doing. It was my decision because of what happened in the '88 Olympics. I always felt if they fought professionally, it would have been the same thing. Even though Bowe was good, Lennox was always such a physically strong and mentally strong big kid that eventually he would have still overpowered Bowe again because he was just that type of a rough guy. If he had ever fought Riddick Bowe as a professional, even before Bowe had slipped and lost his talent and his skill, Lennox would have hurt Riddick Bowe, I think, very seriously because he had a real hatred for Riddick Bowe. So I'm glad that's a fight that I never saw." The career of Lennox Lewis, or at least some highlights seen through the eyes of Manny Steward, a backstage pass, and a glimpse into their working relationship. A lot of fun memories I've got from that particular era, the 1990s. Things always look better in retrospect than they did at the time, to most people anyway. For me personally, the 90s was a golden age as I lived through it. I loved the 90s. It used to make me angry when I would read all the negative articles written in the American press in particular about how terrible the heavyweight division was, how there was no talent, how none of these guys could fight, how they were constantly banging on about Mike Tyson needs to come out of prison so he could clear the division up and sort out this mess. They didn't realize that the mess was actually a competitive division. And that's a beautiful thing. They wanted a monolithic champion because that's what Mike Tyson was in the mid to late 80s. But he was a monolithic champion because he didn't have the level of competition at the time that he would later meet in the 1990s. And what fun is a monolithic champion anyway? Why do people want to see a monolithic champion? Somebody who just dominates every fight and it's never competitive. What's enjoyable about that? Isn't it far more interesting when the division is highly competitive and it's more of a round robin type situation? You might have one guy who is a standout, but he's not having it all his own way, like Muhammad Ali in the 1970s. That's what made that era great. Ali didn't have it all his own way. He had it all his own way in the 60s when he became champion after he beat Liston. But in the 70s, Ali was older. He'd been out the ring for several years. He had a couple comeback fights, then lost to Joe Frazier. He was in the wilderness for a little bit. Then he lost to Ken Norton, came back from that. Eventually got a shot again against George Foreman, upset the odds. And even after the Foreman fight, he had plenty of tough encounters. Eventually lost to Leon Spinks at the back end of his career before coming back and avenging it and becoming the first man to win the World Heavyweight title 3 times. But as I say, that's what made the 70s exciting, was the fact that there wasn't one guy who was just completely dominating everybody. People were invested in the Ali story, but Ali was never a monolithic, completely dominant champion in the 70s. He was in the 60s, but not in the 70s. The Ali era was before my time, but that's what got me into boxing. I was given videotapes, documentaries, and fights of the Ali era, and I was captivated. I was captivated by the Ali story, the different characters that were around at the time. And I saw parallels between what was happening in the 1990s and what was happening in the 70s. Obviously not as many parallels as I should have seen, and particularly with regards to Mike Tyson, right? Mike Tyson and George Foreman had a lot of similarities in terms of what they represented in the heavyweight division at the time. Totally different fighters stylistically, but Foreman represented an immovable object. People felt like he was invincible. I remember an American boxing journalist, I think it was Eisenberg, who said that he fought George Foreman as he thought with Sonny Liston previously, who was Foreman's mentor. He thought that Foreman would be champion for life. He thought that George Foreman was invincible. There was nobody out there who could defeat him. And fast forward a decade or so, Mike Tyson had people feeling the same way in the mid to late 80s. People felt like this guy cannot be beaten. So there was parallels between the two eras. And obviously Mike Tyson, going into the 1990s, he'd already lost by then. He lost to Buster Douglas in 1990, went to prison. After a few fights, he fought Henry Tillman, Alex Stewart, the 2 fights against Razor Ruddock. Then he went to prison. When he came out in 1995, there was so much hype surrounding him. People thought he was just going to destroy the heavyweight division again. There was a lot of intrigue when it came to the Peter McNeely fight. And some people actually were quite critical because Mike Tyson did get pinned on the ropes and McNeely got some shots off. But then he came back against Buster Mathis. Then he wiped out Frank Bruno, and people felt like it's just going to be another dominant reign for Mike Tyson. But older boxing fans, more veteran boxing fans than I was at the time, I was only a teenager, they really should have seen the signs that Mike Tyson was going to go the same way of George Foreman. Because when somebody believes they're hyped to that extent, it's usually just a matter of time before they end up taking a beating, irrespective of how good they are. Because when someone believes in their hype, believes they're indestructible, how could you possibly train to your maximum ability if you think you're invincible? You're not going to. You have to have some level of fear in order to motivate yourself to keep training just as hard every time, or pushing yourself to become better every time. Yeah, vanity and ego plays a part, but Mike Tyson had had how many world title fights? The Buster Douglas fight was his 10th, I believe. So by the time he came out of prison, fought Frank Bruno, 11, 12 world title fights. It's hard to just keep pushing and pushing yourself if you don't really fear anything, you know? If you don't have any doubts in the back of your mind, just little doubts. So there was a lot of parallels between the 1990s and 1970s, and the chaotic nature of the division is what made it so entertaining. And that's why I see today as well. This is why I recognized long before Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, etc. became world heavyweight champions, I recognized that we were moving into a new golden age of heavyweight boxing, and I was right. I know some people are still going to try and say, oh, it's not a golden age. No, it is. When people look back on our current era in heavyweight boxing, they will look back with fond memories, and they will lament and say, oh, I wish it was like when AJ and Fury were fighting, and then when Wilder was about, and Dylan White. We had great fighters back then, great times, great memories. There will come a time, probably in the not too distant future, when people wish they could rewind time and go back to this particular era in the heavyweight division. Trust me on that one. Remember, I said it. Always happens that way.